Today, we're talking about a king from ancient Sri Lanka, a man named Mahasen. And his story is just, well, it's full of contradictions. He was a creator, but he was also a destroyer. And his legacy leaves us with this really incredible puzzle.
And that's the puzzle, right there. The big question we're tackling today. How does a guy who's remembered as a heretic end up becoming a god? I mean, just think about that. He committed one of the worst acts of sacrilege imaginable in his time, yet for 2,000 years, people have worshipped him. It doesn't make sense on the surface. So let's dig in and unpack this story.
So look at this. On one hand, you've got the historical figure, King Mahasen, ruled way back in the 3rd century. His big claim to fame, at least in some books, he's the guy who completely leveled the most sacred monastery in the entire kingdom. But on the other hand, you have Minaria Devio, the god of Minaria, a divine being people have prayed to for centuries for good harvests and life-giving rain. And here's the kicker. They are the exact same person. So how do we get from point A to point B? To get it, we've got to look at both sides of the coin, starting with his genius.
Okay, so before all the drama, before the controversy, Mahasen was an absolute visionary. We're talking one of the greatest builders of the ancient world, period. And he wasn't just putting up fancy temples or palaces. No, his vision was way, way bigger. He wanted to tame the very land itself. 16. Just let that number sink in for a second. That's how many major reservoirs, or tanks as they're known there, he's credited with building. And we're not talking about some small village ponds here. These were massive, man-made lakes, brilliantly engineered to capture monsoon rains and turn dry, dusty plains into fertile rice paddies. 16 of them. It's just an unbelievable achievement.
And the sheer scale, it's honestly hard to wrap your head around. Just one of them, the Minaria Reservoir, covers over 4,500 acres. That is huge. And you have to understand, these weren't just isolated projects. No, this was a complex, interconnected system, a brilliant network designed to literally sustain an entire civilization.
So you might be wondering, okay, you've got these huge lakes, but how do you fill them up? Well, Mahasen had an answer for that too, the Ilahara Canal. This thing was basically a man-made river. It stretched for 54 miles. And in some spots, it was wider than a football field is long. This was the artery, the absolute lifeblood for his entire agricultural revolution. And look, this isn't just us looking back with our modern eyes and being impressed. Way later, a 19th century British governor, a guy who'd seen the great engineering works of the entire British Empire, he was just stunned by this. He wrote that nothing he'd ever seen, ancient or modern, could even compare to these structures. That tells you everything. Mahasen was a builder on an epic, world-class scale. But that's only half the story. All right, so now we have to completely shift gears. Because for all that incredible creation, there was an equally powerful story of destruction. And it all stems from a deep religious conflict that was so intense, it nearly tore the entire kingdom in two.
So to really get what happened next, you need to understand the Mahavihara. Think of it like the Vatican of Sri Lankan Buddhism at the time. It wasn't just a monastery. For over 600 years, it was the center of faith, of learning, of royal power. It was the absolute heart of the kingdom's entire belief system.
But here's the problem. Mahasen had different ideas. Ever since he was a kid, he'd been taught by a monk from a rival Buddhist sect. So when he becomes king, he puts his thumb on the scale. He makes a proclamation making it illegal for anyone to give food to the monks of the Mahavihara. I mean, they were literally being starved out. They had no choice but to abandon their ancient home. And once it was empty, Mahasen gave the order. Raze it. Tear the entire 600-year-old complex to the ground. This was just an unthinkable act of destruction. It was so shocking, so profound, that it pushed the kingdom right to the brink of a civil war. And it led to one of the most dramatic confrontations you'll find in Sri Lankan history. Just try to picture this scene. You've got two armies, staring each other down across a reservoir, ready for battle. The commander of one army? King Mahasen himself. And the commander of the other? His own chief minister, and his childhood best friend, a man named Meghavana Paya, who had raised a rebel army to stop him. According to the chronicles, the minister crossed over to the king's camp that night, just to share a meal with his old friend. And in the middle of dinner, the king just looks at him and asks, "Why? Why are you doing this to me?" And the minister's answer was just as direct. "Because you destroyed the Mahavihara." And that was the turning point. Faced with that simple, honest conviction from his closest friend, something in the king just broke. He felt true remorse. He apologized right then and there and promised he would rebuild the whole thing. And just like that, the civil war was over before it even started. So the king repented, story over, happy ending, right? Well, if you think it's that simple, you haven't been paying attention. This is King Mahasen we're talking about. Nothing with this guy was ever going to be that straightforward. Now, he did keep his promise. He rebuilt the Mahavihara. But then, in a move that is just pure Mahasen, he builds another stupa, the Jetavan Armaya, one of the tallest ancient structures in the world, right on the Mahavihara's land. And who do you think he gives it to? Yep, the very same rival sect that caused all the trouble in the first place. So even in reconciliation, he's a man of contradictions. He restores the old guard while at the same time elevating their rivals. You know, there's really no better way to sum up his entire reign than this one line from the Mahavamsa, the great ancient chronicle of Sri Lanka. He collected many merits and many sins. It just perfectly captures the duality of the man, doesn't it? He was a great builder and a great destroyer. And this brings us right back to our central question. In the end, the generations that came after him, they made a choice. The religious fights of the court, all that faded over time. But the water in his 16 great reservoirs kept flowing. It fed the people and it sustained the kingdom. They chose to remember the merit of the life-giver over the sin of the heretic. And so, the builder king was reborn in their memory as Mineria Vavio, the god of Mineria.
The story of Mahasen leaves us with this powerful question that really echoes through history, doesn't it? When we look back at these complex figures, people capable of both incredible good and terrible harm, what's the right way to measure their legacy? What do we elevate, what do we condemn, and ultimately, what do we choose to remember?